Hello and welcome to Pleasure Reading. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and this is a podcast about the pleasure of reading, where I share curated reading lists, author rankings, chats with my bookish friends, and more. If you too take pleasure in reading, I hope that you will subscribe and share this show with a friend. Cheers to your next best book. Hello and welcome to Pleasure Reading. I'm Amelia Ruby, and I am the host of this show where I share curated lists of book recommendations on all sorts of topics. So far, I have done a lot of fiction lists, so today we are going to have our first nonfiction episode, and I will be sharing my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies. Now, when I titled this episode, I had to ask myself, does anyone call themselves a foodie anymore? Did that phrase go the way of being a hipster? Am I going to sound so out of date or old? But what I'm trying to get at when I say foodie here is anyone who loves food and enjoys not just cooking or eating, but also all of the cultural aspects of food. Perhaps you or someone you love really loves restaurant culture or hospitality culture or has worked in restaurants, or maybe you work on a farm or you grow food in your garden, or you have beloved family members who spend a lot of time thinking about how fruits and vegetables and grains are grown in the United States, or who have deep relationships with animals that are then slaughtered to provide food for human beings. So there are so many ways to be involved with food, to love food, to be close to food. And this episode is for anyone who can identify with that, anyone who loves food in any of its forms and any of the ways that it finds itself onto a plate or into our bodies. And I love all of those things. So I'm really excited to share this episode. In this list of 8 nonfiction reads for foodies, I have a variety of types of nonfiction as well. So I've got an essay collection, 2 memoirs, 2 nonfiction, sort of argument books, books that have a thesis that they're unpacking over a series of chapters, 2 cookbooks, and then 1 almost business book at the very end. So there's going to be a nice range of types of nonfiction across the episode, and I really hope that you will stay tuned to hear about all of these amazing reads. And if you enjoy them, of course, I hope that you'll check out the show notes and head to my bookshop links where you can purchase a copy, and I will receive a small affiliate payment that just helps me stay resourced to keep making these episodes for you. So that's what's coming up in this episode. Let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book on my list of my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies is an essay collection entitled An Everlasting Meal: Cooking with Economy and Grace by Tamar Adler. This book of essays came out back in 2011, and just last year, I believe in 2023, Tamar Adler put out a cookbook around these same themes. So there are kind of 2 books, within this one book recommendation, but I'm specifically recommending the essay collection, An Everlasting Meal. Although I have to say, the cookbook was a James Beard Award winner or nominee. So it's got to be great as well. I just haven't read it myself yet. So in An Everlasting Meal, Tamar Adler issues what she calls a rallying cry to home cooks. And the essays in this collection really cover the basics of cooking from home. And they're really about how to, I would say, craft a kitchen that makes cooking feel easy. So there are chapters about boiling water, chapters about cooking eggs, how to sort of summon a meal from your empty cupboards. There's really a philosophy undergirding this book that has a lot to do with making the most of everything that you buy and to really use every piece of the ingredients that you're purchasing to make your meals. And to do so in a way that's delicious and full of pleasure. So I love the subtitle of this book, Cooking with Economy and Grace, because it really gets at the dual aspect of this author's philosophy, which is that we can cook with such simplicity. There can be a real economy to our cooking, but it can also be graceful. It can be pleasurable. It can be delicious. And that really comes out in how there are these very simple, delicious recipes kind of woven through the essays in this book. This book is the one and only reason that I ever have or know how to boil a chicken, which was not something I'd ever done before I read this book, and has become a sort of staple, simple meal in our household and like a foundation of many of our weekly menus. So highly recommend An Everlasting Meal, Cooking with Economy and Grace by Tamar Adler. The essay collection's amazing. You can pick it up in my bookshop link or honestly on like Thrift Books or something very affordably. And then I'm excited to check out this new cookbook that I just learned about. So that is available as well. And I'll link both of those in the show notes. The second book on my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies is our first memoir of the episode, and that is Burn the Place by Elena Regan. So Burn the Place chronicles Elena Regan's journey from foraging on her family farm to running her Michelin-starred restaurant, which is called Elizabeth in Chicago. And the book really takes its time to show what her upbringing was like and how plants were really embedded in her day-to-day life from a very young age. It paints the picture of this like intense connection that she had with food and with the earth. And even though she really struggled throughout her life to understand her identity, and she struggled with addiction, and she encountered a lot of sexism when she entered the restaurant industry. Like, even though she dealt with all of that, grounding herself in relationship with food and learning to cook and become a chef really shaped how she navigates the world. And there was definitely a piece of me that like wanted more of the like, tell me about your fancy restaurant. Tell me about all of the industry gossip that you encountered in Chicago. Like there was a part of me that kind of wanted that salaciousness to it. I really appreciated that this book stays so centered in Elena's experience and in conversations around identity and recovery and just the like deep emotional, instinctual connections that she has with ingredients and how she shapes them into the delicious menus that she creates. So again, this book is called Burn the Place. It's Elena's first memoir. She wrote a second memoir called Field Work, which is about foraging, that is more recent. Burn the Place came out in 2020 and Fieldwork came out in 2023, but I think that just personally, I'm partial to Burn the Place. I highly recommend it. I enjoyed it on audiobook, one of like the rare, honestly, audiobooks that I listened to the whole thing. And it was like a great accompaniment for a day that I was doing some work around my home. And this is another one that is available like very inexpensively in a lot of resale shops or thrift books, etc. So highly recommend Burn the Place by Elena Regan. The third book in my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies is the second memoir on this list, and maybe the second most popular book on this list, and that is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. So if you entered a independent bookstore, or honestly even like a straight up Barnes & Noble in the past 3 years, you probably saw the cover of this book somewhere. Even if you didn't notice it or pick it up, you probably saw this red book that had 2 pairs of chopsticks holding noodles between them, and it says Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner on the cover. Like it has been everywhere. And this is definitely a memoir that, in my opinion, lives up to the hype. So before writing this book, Michelle Zauner was best known as the Grammy-nominated musician who performed as Japanese Breakfast. And this memoir is not so much about her music. In fact, it's not really about the music at all. It's about her relationship with her Korean mother and her grief over the loss of her mother when her mother passed away. And the way that Michelle Zauner tells this story is largely through her relationship with food and the foods that her mother would make or feed her or encourage her to eat, and their trips to H Mart, which is a Korean or Asian grocery store. So after her mother died when Michelle was 25, visits to H Mart became these like portals to and through her grief over the loss of her mother. And the book is really about the reckoning that she went through in this grief and kind of tracing her identity as a mixed race Asian American kid becoming an adult and trying to find herself in her music and in food and in life. And so, again, this is a very popular memoir, but I really would totally say it lives up to the hype. And I highly recommend Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. Okay, now we're moving on from memoirs and heading to the fourth book on my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies, and that is No Meat Required: The Cultural History and Culinary Future of Plant-Based Eating by Alicia Kennedy. So, as you might have guessed from my mention of boiling a chicken at the very beginning of this episode, I eat meat and plants and all of the things, and I'm grateful to not have food allergies or even very many foods I dislike. So, I really do eat kind of everything. But that said, I really appreciated this book and the way that Alicia Kennedy traces the culinary and cultural history of plant-based eating in the US. And I think that this book really makes the argument that the food we eat is a political choice and that becoming a vegetarian or a vegan can be a political action. And she traces sort of these different cultural histories that are political histories. And I really enjoyed the clear punk feminist ethos of this book and the way that Alicia Kennedy traces that through plant-based eating in and of itself. There is also a very strong critique of capitalist food systems in this book and a critique of lab-grown meats. So there's a lot here that I found really compelling and was really grateful to read just such a succinct and potent argument for plant-based eating. And it really had me asking myself, is eating meat in alignment with my values? And is plant-based eating sort of the way I want to go in the future? Is that more of an orientation or a value system or a practice that I want to take on and live by? So this one definitely has a political point of view, so may not be for everybody, but for me, definitely one of my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies. Whether you eat meat or not, I think it's just really informative and you'll learn a lot reading this book. On to my 5th book in my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies, and that is Eat and Flourish: How Food Supports Emotional Well-Being by Mary Beth Albright. So I want to say outright that this is the closest thing that we're going to get to a book about how to eat. It's also the closest we will get to any sort of I hate to even say this word, diet book that we will get on this list. But especially if you're new to me, you need to know that I am adamantly anti-diet culture, adamantly anti-diet. And I almost put an anti-diet book on this list. I was like, my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies, probably Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison. but that felt a little bit off topic for this. I am going to do an episode in the new year about books that help you break up with diet culture. So we will get there. We will talk about that. But I think that as someone who has gone through this process of divesting from diet culture, at least in my relationship with myself and my personal habits, I have often felt okay, I don't diet anymore, but how do I make decisions about what to eat? How can I be in touch with this? And I think intuitive eating is a great practice, but just hasn't written a great book, not a book that I'm going to put on my list of my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies. So if there's anybody in your life that you're they're really interested in different ways of eating and how to understand how what we eat impacts our well-being, this is my go-to pick for that type of person. Maybe that person is you. If you are that person, this is my go-to pick for you. So again, this book is called Eat and Flourish: How Food Supports Emotional Well-Being by Mary Beth Albright. And this is an evidence-based argument that a whole food diet is good for your mental health. And so Mary Beth Albright kind of walks through how food supports our mind, our emotions, and our bodies, and how all of this is interwoven. There's a lot of research in this book. There are a ton of citations in this book, and there is a really clear and cogent redefinition of emotional eating, like quote unquote emotional eating, that talks about how food triggers different emotional responses in our body. And that's a good thing. Like emotional eating has been labeled a bad thing by diet culture, but actually this is really good for us. And we can partner with food and appreciate food for all the different ways that it has and can nourish us. So I am not here to tell anybody how to eat. I don't think that's interesting or helpful. And I certainly don't have credentials to do that. But for me, this was just a helpful sort of invitation to think about the science of food from a perspective that is not pushing a diet. And so if that's something you're looking for, I do recommend Eat and Flourish, How Food Supports Emotional Well-Being by Mary Beth Albright. And I recommend reading it with your own critical thinking cap on, be in conversation with the book. It's not giving you a how-to manual. It's giving you an invitation to think about some things. That's how I like to engage nonfiction writ large, if I'm being honest. Okay. Now let's move on to the 2 cookbooks that I have put on this list. So I think I could do a whole episode on cookbooks and cookbooks that I think are great. But for this list of my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies, I have picked cookbooks that I think are really more about the practice of cooking than they are about any particular recipes. So the first cookbook that I'm going to shout out is definitely the most popular book in this whole list. And that is Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Mastering the Elements of Good Cooking by Salman Nasrat. So obviously, this book became a Netflix show. It is incredibly popular. But just in case you are a person who has not read it yet or has not picked it up or has not looked at it, I think that this is my favorite book to learn how to cook. To read and be taught an approach to cooking where you can really start from the beginning, you can learn the foundational elements, and then you can practice it through the recipes that are presented in the book. Of course, there are also these really lovely illustrations. There are now special edition copies of this book. It's such a wonderful gift for yourself if you are trying to get more into cooking in the months or year ahead, or for someone else. I think of this as a book that would make a great gift as a housewarming gift for somebody who's buying their first home, or for a college grad who's moving into their first apartment. That's the kind of person I would give this book to. So they can really kind of develop the cooking essentials. And then these are skills that you can take to any other cookbook you would ever buy, and you'll just know how to do things. And also so that you can put meals together for yourself without needing recipes, which I think is such a skill, and one that I used to have and don't really anymore. So I need to return to this book myself. And that is Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Salman Nasrat. The second cookbook on this list is the newest book on this list, and that is What Goes With What? 100 Recipes, 20 Charts, and Endless Possibilities by Julia Turshen. I love Julia Turshen's work. I think that she is just such a compelling writer, and I really appreciate that she comes to cooking also with an anti-diet approach. I feel like we share a lot of similar values around food and life, and that's important to me when I engage with people's work. So in this new cookbook, it literally came out a few weeks before I am releasing this. This book is full of simple, no frills, utterly satisfying recipes. But more than that, it teaches you Julia's problem-solving approach to figuring out what to cook. So this book reminded me a lot of An Everlasting Meal, but it's presented in more of a cookbook way than a set of essays way, because here you're going to learn a way to think about cooking that helps you put a meal together no matter what you might have on hand. And so where Tamar Adler did that through essays and a sort of philosophical creative approach, in What Goes With What, Julia Turshen is doing that with charts and recipes and, a much more visual, tactical approach. And so I just really appreciate that, and definitely think this is a foundational cookbook for home cooks. And that's why it made it onto my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies. And that takes us to the final book on this list. So we have already gone through 7 of my top nonfiction reads for foodies. We have talked about my favorite essay collection, 2 memoirs, 2 nonfiction argument books, and 2 cookbooks. And we are landing with, surprise of all surprises, a business book. So if you asked me what book had changed my thinking the most in the past 2 or 3 years, it would be this book. It would be Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara. The subtitle of this book is The Remarkable Power of Giving People More Than They Expect. And this book chronicles Will Guidara's career in hospitality, working for like juggernauts like Daniel Boulud and Danny Meyer, and then taking the helm at 11 Madison Park and spending more than a decade there, evolving that restaurant to eventually be named the best restaurant in the world. So this is a book that is about food, but it's really about hospitality culture. And so any foodie who loves restaurants and who loves the restaurant experience and who loves everything about hospitality, this is a book for them. And not only are you going to get that behind the scenes peek into 11 Madison Park, which was fascinating to me, it also is like a teaching tool. This book really teaches you how to center unreasonable hospitality in your own work, in your own life. And so I read it as a business owner, really taking up the call to think about how could my business, which is a podcast production studio, how could this podcast production studio be a hospitality business? How could I be in the business of hospitality, even when I'm doing something like so far outside of that industry, which we would typically think of as like restaurants, hotels, etc., right? So I love the premise at the center of this book, which is that we can transform ordinary transactions into extraordinary experiences. And the writing is wonderful, the stories are great, and the lessons are just remarkable. So like I put this book last because it really like sparkles for me. Chef's kiss, pun intended. It is probably my favorite nonfiction read at all of the past few years, and definitely makes my top 8 nonfiction reads for foodies. So that's the whole list, my friends. We have now talked about An Everlasting Meal by Tamar Adler, Burn the Place by Elena Regan, Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner, Eat and Flourish by Mary Beth Albright, No Meat Required by Alicia Kennedy, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Salma Nasrat, What Goes With What by Julia Turshen, and Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara. If you love food, eating, plants, the world, yourself, your body, anything else, I hope that you might pick up one of these books. And as always, the links are there for you in the show notes. That does take you to my bookshop affiliate page. And if you make a purchase through that link, I will receive just a tiny little payment as a thank you for sharing the book, spreading the word, etc. So thank you so much again for tuning in to this episode of Pleasure Reading. It's been a joy to do our first nonfiction episode together, and I can't wait for many more episodes to come. Cheers to your next best book.